Some of the biggest regrets I have from my adult life are about the events that I didn't go to. The weddings of friends that I didn't attend, trips not taken, friends not seen, parties that I never decided not to attend. I think as I look back, for each of those, that my calculus at the time was about being too busy or having a lot of schoolwork to do or needing to work or these other commitments that seemed to impinge on what I saw as extra, as this sort of bonus time with other people. In each of those incidents, I valued achievement over connection, the material over the relational. That for the sake of what was immediately in front of me, I put aside those more long-term and deeper connections to other people. And at the time, those decisions seemed to make sense. They seemed to be what was right in the moment. But as I look back, I realize that I wish I had been there in so many of those incidences. That was brought to home for me as I looked over this week's gospel, where we have this parable about a king throwing a banquet for his son's wedding. He invites all of his friends. He sends out invitations in advance. And when we get to the parable today, we hear about the servants who have gone out to remind them, to tell them when exactly the wedding feast would be, to let them know that the table was laid. When that day comes, they avoid the invitation. They don't heed the call. For the one, it's the needs of his farm that he must attend to. For the other, it's his business. But for each of them, they choose their own material well-being and security and the needs that they perceive in that regard over the person who has invited them to the wedding banquet. And back in the king's city, he sends his servants to pull people off of the street and bring them into the banquet instead of the ones who didn't heed the call. These complete strangers are willing to do what those invited guests, the friends, maybe even relatives of the king would not. They answer the invitation to celebrate a day that needs celebrating. Our gospel pits these two different values against one another. We have those who live for their own gain and their own interest, and those who live for the health and strength of their community, those who are willing to put aside their own concerns and needs for the sake of another. I think there are all kinds of connections we can draw to those competing values, or those values that are at least in tension in this reading. I think within that, there's a parable that we could tell about how to behave in a pandemic, about the choice to put aside our own comfort or our own desire for normalcy to ensure the health and safety of our community. But today, as we look ahead to Indigenous Peoples Day being celebrated tomorrow around our country, there are other connections we can make. The valuing of economic desire and monetary commitment over relationships. It mirrors so much of the history of our own nation, especially as it pertains to the native peoples who called it home long before our ancestors ever stepped foot on it. From the first moment the white settlers stepped onto this land, they viewed it primarily through an economic lens. The questions that drove them were either what can we take from this land, or how can we make this land ours? They were driven by the desire to possess and to extract, to plant their ways in this new soil, and to seek to flourish within it. And those desires came into conflict with the native people who called this land home, whose ancestors who had been nourished by this soil for thousands of generations. Their knowledge of the land was passed down through those generations. It was at the heart of their stories, their belief systems, their ways of life. The land wasn't something to possess or to take from. It was something to live in relationship with. While the story is more complicated than that, it's deniable that there was a clash between those two ways of living on the land. Just as those wedding guests who were invited to the wedding in that parable had to make a decision between their own economic interest and the relationship with the one who invited them, we all have to answer questions about how we'll relate to the land around us. Is it there for our taking, for our sake, no matter the cost? Or do we have an obligation to care for it, to tend our relationship with it? In our country today, our public lands are increasingly threatened by the desires of extractive industries that view it as a collection of commodities to be harvested, refined, and sold, whether that's timber, oil, water, the animals that call it home. That's not to say all extraction is bad, but I think when the land is viewed primarily as a commodity, then we start to go astray. Right now, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the northern part of Alaska is being open to oil and gas development. The refuge has long been sacred to the Gwich'in people and home to the caribou that they hunt that are essential to their survival and their way of life. These new developments in gas and oil exploration threaten that way of life. They threaten the very integrity of the ecosystems that give life to the caribou and to the people and other predators that rely on them. This is just one example of what happens when we as humans value material gain over the value of community. Our gospel today invites us to consider another way. Jesus starts this parable, like so many others, with the phrase, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to." And the challenge of this and every parable is for us to figure out the ways in which that parable is like the kingdom of heaven. And I can't help but sense that the heart of this one is that scene where the king sends the servants out into the streets to pull everyone into the wedding banquet. They bring in everyone, good and bad, not just those deemed worthy, but everyone. In that act, a new community is formed. All divisions are erased and all are invited to eat. It's a vision of beloved community, a community in which all are welcome, in which relationships are more important than material gain and accomplishment. One of the most powerful things that I have learned from Indigenous writers and thinkers, storytellers and teachers is that beloved community is not just about people. We also share a relationship to the land, and that relationship is not one way. It's not just that we depend on the land for our sustenance, but the land depends on us. We aren't separate from the ecosystems. We're not separate from the landscape. We're a part of it. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is an Indigenous ecologist, who has written beautifully about her attempts to weave her scientific training and background with the stories and ways of knowing that she received from her own ancestors, her own Indigenous ancestors. And she talks about a way of connecting to our earth that is not about taking or extraction, but is about reciprocity. It's about balance. It's about both the gifts that the earth gives to us, but also the gifts that we have to share with the earth, to the other people and the other creatures that inhabit it. She writes about that reciprocity this way. One of our responsibilities as human people is to find ways to enter into reciprocity with the more than human world. We can do it through gratitude, through ceremony, through land stewardship, science, art, and in everyday practices of practical reverence. That reciprocity is about love and the loving invitation to wholeness and community, to not be conquerors over the land around us, but part of a whole earth community. What she writes, and I think what is at the heart of our parable, is about moving from seeing other people and the world around us as through the lens of commodity, asking those questions of what we can gain or what we can get from others, to a vision to a lens of relationship, to seeing the land itself as a gift, to seeing the other people around us as gifts. The parable is about valuing connection over commodity. And tomorrow, on Indigenous Peoples Day, I think what we're celebrating, what we're honoring, is the legacy of those who tended the land before us, those who knew the names of the plants, those who knew every hill and valley, who cared for it, who called it home, who saw the land not as something to own, to possess, and to take from, but to enter into relationship with. And I think that relationship of reciprocity, the land, is also what we're called to in our relationship to God. We don't just receive. Yes, God has promised us this gift of incredible grace and love, embodied in the person of Jesus. But we have our role to play in that relationship. And that's how we take that love that we have been given and to show it to others in this world, to show it to our neighbors, to show it to the other people and all the creatures that are a part of our wider community. That is our call, to reciprocity with God, to reciprocity with the earth, to reciprocity with every human being. And to see ourselves in webs of interconnectedness and relationship. Amen.